Hey guys, tonight we're going to step back in time, far, far back, to an age of gods, heroes, and cunning deception. Our story tonight is one that has echoed through centuries, whispered by poets, sung by bards, and painted upon ancient walls. It's the story of the Trojan Horse, a tale of brilliance and betrayal, of faith and folly, and one of the most iconic moments in all of myth and legend. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy the kind of content that merges myth and mystery. And hey, let us know from where you're watching and what time it is for you right now. It's time now to dim the lights and let's cover what we have for tonight. Together, the tale of the Trojan horse cannot be understood without first stepping into the world it was born from, a world of bronze, blood, and divine interference. Picture this: the Aegean Sea glimmering under a pale sun, its waves carrying the reflection of 1,000 black ships, each one heavy with warriors, shields glinting like scales of iron, spears resting against the rails, and banners whipping in the salty wind. This was the Greek Armada, an alliance of kingdoms united by both vengeance and pride, bound together under a single purpose: to bring down the mighty city of Troy. Troy stood like a jewel at the edge of the known world, positioned near the Dardanelles, where Europe meets Asia. It was a city of immense wealth and influence, controlling the trade routes between the Aegean and the Black Sea. Its walls, massive and gleaming in the sunlight, were said to have been built by the hands of gods themselves, a gift from Poseidon and Apollo. From those walls, the Trojans could see the enemy encamped along the shore, their fires glowing like a second constellation beneath the stars. For 10 long years, those fires never went out. The war had started as a personal vendetta, a king seeking to reclaim his stolen queen. But over time, it transformed into something far larger, a struggle that drew in entire nations, and even the gods who ruled over them. What began as revenge became a test of fate, a contest of human endurance and divine will. The Greeks, under the leadership of Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, had gathered the greatest heroes of their age: Achilles, swift and fierce, unmatched in battle; Odysseus, the cunning king of Ithaca; Ajax the Great, towering and indomitable; and Menelaus himself, whose wife Helen had been taken by the Trojan prince Paris. Across the plains stood the Trojans, led by their noble prince Hector, a warrior both courageous and compassionate, a man who fought not for conquest, but for the safety of his people. Troy was not a land of savages or villains, but of civilization, art, and commerce. The Trojans were respected, proud, and deeply loyal to their city and its gods. Yet fate had chosen them as the stage upon which one of humanity's greatest dramas would unfold. By the time the Trojan horse would enter the story, the war had already become something unnatural, almost timeless. The first years saw great battles upon the plains of Ilium. Spears clashed, chariots thundered, and heroes fell whose names would echo through eternity. But as years turned into a decade, the war stagnated. Neither side could claim true victory. The Greeks controlled the beaches and their camp, but the walls of Troy stood unbroken. No siege engine, no assault could bring them down. Every attempt to storm the gates ended in blood and retreat. The Trojans, though trapped inside, continued to thrive under their king Priam's leadership. They had supplies, the protection of their gods, and above all, the confidence that no mortal force could breach their divine walls. Outside those walls, however, life for the Greeks had grown harsh. The sea air corroded their armor, the sun burned their skin, tempers flared between kings and warriors. Even their greatest hero, Achilles, had quarreled with Agamemnon, refusing to fight and bringing despair to the Greek army. The gods, too, quarreled among themselves. Athena and Hera favoring the Greeks, Aphrodite and Apollo standing with Troy. Lightning and plague were as much a part of the war as swords and arrows. The conflict had spilled beyond the physical world into the heavens themselves. As months turned into years, exhaustion seeped into every heart. Imagine the despair of men who had left their homes, their families, and their kingdoms for what they believed would be a swift campaign. Children had been born in their absence, rulers had aged, and kingdoms back home began to wonder if their warriors would ever return. For many, the war had become a curse, yet still they fought, because retreat would mean dishonor, and honor, in that age, was everything. Inside Troy, the mood was different, but equally heavy. Though their city remained intact, its people lived in the shadow of uncertainty. Every day they saw the Greek ships on the horizon, unmoving, patient, like vultures, waiting for death. Priam's sons, Hector, Paris, and Deiphobus, continued to lead their forces in defense of the city, but every victory cost lives they could not replace. The women of Troy prayed daily to Athena, to Apollo, to any god who would listen. The sound of the sea carried not songs, but the echo of suffering. The war had long since stopped being about Helen herself. She had become more symbol than woman, a living representation of the pride and vanity that drove men to destroy themselves. The Greeks claimed they fought to reclaim her, but in truth, they fought because they could not bear to lose. The Trojans fought because they could not bear to surrender. The gods watched with fascination as mortals tangled themselves deeper into the threads of fate. By the 9th year, morale among the Greeks had withered. Their supplies dwindled, their ships required constant repair, and many of their warriors had fallen to disease or desertion. Even their victories seemed hollow. The Trojans, though battered, remained defiant. The endless stalemate had begun to break the spirit of both sides, and yet, beneath that despair, something was forming, an idea, a whisper of cunning that would turn the tide of history. For though Achilles' strength had carried the Greeks through their darkest hours, it would be Odysseus's mind that would bring them victory. The Trojan War was not destined to end in glorious battle or divine intervention. It would end through human craft, through deception, and the manipulation of belief. But that revelation was still to come. For now, the scene was one of desolation and weariness. The beaches were littered with the remnants of 10 years of struggle, broken shields, empty helmets, and the ashes of countless funeral pyres. The sea breeze carried the smell of salt and smoke and the faint, bitter scent of despair. The war had become a way of life. Generations of soldiers knew no other world than this narrow strip of land between the city and the sea. They woke to the clang of armor. They slept to the sound of distant horns. And in their dreams, they saw home. For Troy, the siege was an unending storm that never passed. For Greece, it was a wound that refused to heal. Neither side understood that their fates were already sealed, not by the sword, but by a single idea taking root in the mind of a weary, clever man. So when we speak of the Trojan horse, we must first remember the weight of those 10 years, the desperation that gave birth to cunning, the exhaustion that turned honor into strategy. The horse was not merely a trick, it was the final chapter of a war that had drained every drop of heroism from its warriors. It was the manifestation of human ingenuity born from hopelessness, of a desire to end what strength alone could not. The endless war had forged legends, broken kings, and tested the patience of gods. It was the fire in which both destruction and innovation were born. And as the final year dawned over the plains of Ilium, the Greeks began to understand something vital, that to win this war, they would need more than bravery. They would need to think like the gods themselves. Every war begins somewhere, though the Trojan War stands apart as one whose spark was struck not on a battlefield, but in the heavens themselves, among gods who shaped the destinies of mortals as easily as they moved the stars. To understand why the Greeks and Trojans fought for 10 years, to grasp why a single wooden horse would one day bring down a city, we have to travel further back to a divine banquet, a golden apple, and a fateful choice made by one man whose beauty and vanity set the world on fire. Long before the Greek ships gathered at Troy, there was a wedding on Mount Pelion. The sea goddess Thetis was marrying Peleus, a mortal king. Every god and goddess was invited to this divine celebration, except for one, Eris, the goddess of discord. She was unwelcome, because wherever she went, trouble followed. But Eris was not one to be ignored. As the banquet glowed with laughter, music, and divine light, she appeared uninvited, and in her hand she carried a golden apple. Upon its gleaming surface were inscribed 3 simple words: to the fairest. That apple, small and shining, became the seed of ruin. 3 goddesses immediately claimed it: Hera, the proud queen of the gods; Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war; and Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. None would yield. Each believed herself the fairest, each certain the apple was meant for her. Zeus, the ruler of Olympus, weary of their quarrel, refused to judge between them. Instead, he decreed that a mortal man should decide. And so, with a sly twist of divine humor, he sent them to the Trojan prince Paris. Paris was no ordinary man. He was a son of King Priam and Queen Hecuba of Troy, but at his birth it was foretold that he would bring ruin to his city. Terrified, his parents had left him to die on Mount Ida, but fate had other plans. A shepherd found and raised him, unaware that the child he saved would one day shape the fate of nations. Paris grew into a man of striking beauty and gentle charm, a dreamer more than a warrior. And when the 3 goddesses appeared before him, radiant and terrible, he was awestruck. Each goddess offered him a bribe. Hera promised him power, dominion over all of Asia. Athena offered wisdom and victory in battle. But Aphrodite, smiling softly, promised him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. And in that single moment, Paris chose desire over glory and wisdom. He handed the golden apple to Aphrodite, crowning her the fairest of them all. It was a choice that sealed the fate of Troy. The most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, daughter of Zeus and Leda, and wife to Menelaus, king of Sparta. Her beauty was legendary, said to make even the gods envious. Under Aphrodite's spell, and perhaps also through her own restlessness, Helen's heart turned toward Paris when he visited Sparta. Whether she went with him willingly or was taken by force, accounts differ, but the result was the same. She left her husband and her home, and together with Paris, sailed across the sea to Troy. When Menelaus discovered that his wife had been taken, his rage was uncontainable, but beneath his anger was humiliation, and in the world of kings, pride was worth more than love. He called upon his brother, Agamemnon, the most powerful king in Greece, and invoked the oath sworn years earlier by all of Helen's former suitors, a solemn vow that if ever she were taken, they would unite to defend her husband's honor. And so, bound by their word, the kings of Greece gathered their armies. Odysseus, reluctant but bound by oath, Ajax, fierce and unyielding, Nestor, wise and ancient, and Achilles, the son of Peleus and Thetis, destined to be both hero and tragedy. The call to arms spread like wildfire, uniting kingdoms that had long been rivals under one cause, to sail to Troy and bring Helen home. But was it truly about Helen, or was she only the excuse that men and gods needed to wage the greatest war of their age? To many, she was less a woman than a symbol, a prize of beauty, a justification for conquest. Troy was a wealthy city, positioned at the crossroads of trade between East and West. To control Troy was to control the flow of goods, gold, and power. Some historians believe that beneath the myth, there may have been real motives of economics and dominance. The Greeks may have seen in Troy not just the theft of a queen, but the opportunity to break a rival power. Still, myth weaves its truth differently. The poets tell us that the war was born from hubris, the arrogance of mortals and gods alike. Eris's apple, Hera's jealousy, Athena's pride, Aphrodite's seduction, all threads in a tapestry of fate. Paris, the shepherd prince, was merely the hand that pulled the first thread loose. When the Greek fleet assembled at Aulis, it was said to be the largest ever seen, 1,000 ships carrying tens of thousands of warriors. The sea itself seemed to tremble under their oars, but before they could sail, they faced a divine obstacle. The goddess Artemis, angered by Agamemnon's arrogance, stilled the winds, trapping the ships in harbor. To appease her, the seer Calchas declared that Agamemnon must sacrifice his own daughter, Iphigenia. And though he hesitated, ambition overcame his heart. The sacrifice was made. Or, according to some versions, Artemis replaced the girl with a deer at the last moment, and the winds began to blow again. It was a dark omen of the price the Greeks would pay for victory. When they finally reached Troy's shores, the Greeks expected swift triumph. They were met instead by walls higher than any they had ever seen, and a defense as fierce as their own. The Trojans did not cower behind their gates. They rode out to meet the invaders, led by Hector, the pride of Troy, a man who fought with the strength of 10 and the heart of a father protecting his home. For 10 years, the two sides would clash upon the plains of Ilium, locked in a cycle of battle, loss, and grief. So from a divine quarrel came the greatest conflict of the ancient world. The seeds of destruction had been sown not by kings or generals, but by a moment of vanity and a promise of love. Yet, within that myth lies a reflection of something deeply human, the endless struggle between desire and duty, between pride and peace. The gods may have set the pieces in motion, but it was humanity that kept them moving. The origins of the Trojan War remind us that the grandest tragedies often begin with the smallest acts: an apple tossed in jest, a promise whispered under the stars, a decision made in the name of beauty. From such moments, empires fall, and as the Greek ships cut through the waters toward Troy, their sails swollen with both wind and vengeance, none could have imagined that this war, born from the vanity of gods and the love of a woman, would end not with a battle, but with a trick, a gift of wood and deceit that would forever change the meaning of victory. By the time the war between Greece and Troy had stretched into its 10th year, the world had grown weary of its echoes. The clash of swords and the cries of battle had long replaced the songs of peace. The war that began with beauty and betrayal had become a slow and grinding storm, one that neither side could escape. For 10 years, the Greeks and Trojans stood locked in a deadly balance, each too proud to surrender, too stubborn to fall. The Greeks had come to Troy expecting a quick conquest. They were led by the mightiest kings and warriors of their time: Agamemnon of Mycenae, Menelaus of Sparta, Ajax of Salamis, Diomedes of Argos, and Odysseus of Ithaca. They were men of legend, heroes whose names would echo through centuries. Their fleet of 1,000 ships had darkened the horizon. Their soldiers had poured onto the beaches like an unstoppable tide. Yet the walls of Troy loomed before them, unbroken, defiant, a monument to divine craftsmanship. Those walls were said to have been built by gods themselves: Poseidon and Apollo, who had once served King Laomedon, Priam's father, towering high and forged from stones so massive that no mortal hand could move them. The walls of Troy were impregnable. Behind them, the Trojans lived with a strange sense of both security and dread. They watched from their battlements as the Greek army built its camp along the coast, a sprawling city of tents, fires, and war machines. The plains between the city and the sea became a field of endless battle. Every dawn brought new duels, new challenges shouted across the dust, new spears thrown under the watchful eyes of the gods. The names of heroes rose and fell with the sun. Achilles, the greatest warrior among the Greeks, became a living myth, his armor blazing under the light, his wrath unstoppable. Hector, the prince of Troy, fought with equal valor, driven not by pride, but by love for his people and his city. When these two clashed, the very air seemed to shudder, but for all their valor, victory eluded both sides. The Greeks could not breach the city. The Trojans could not drive the invaders away. Each battle ended where it began: in blood, in smoke, in the heavy silence of exhaustion. The war had become a rhythm, a terrible routine. The men on both sides grew older, their armor rusting from salt and time. The young soldiers, who had first sailed with dreams of glory, now fought only to survive another sunrise. Life in the Greek camp was harsh. The sea winds carried the sting of salt and sand. Their tents were battered by storms, and food became scarce. The men lived on rations, on what little they could take from the surrounding lands. Tempers flared easily. Quarrels between kings and generals fractured the unity that had once bound them. The greatest rift came between Agamemnon, the proud commander of the host, and Achilles, the war's brightest flame. When Agamemnon insulted Achilles and took from him the captive woman, Briseis, Achilles withdrew from battle in fury. Without him, the Greeks suffered crushing losses. The Trojans, emboldened, surged from their gates. Under Hector's leadership, they pushed the Greeks back to the edge of the sea, nearly burning their ships. The war seemed on the verge of turning, but fate, ever unpredictable, would not allow either side to triumph completely. The gods, as always, played their games. On Olympus, they quarreled and schemed, each taking sides in a conflict that reflected their own rivalries. Hera and Athena favored the Greeks, still angry over the judgment of Paris. Aphrodite and Apollo stood by the Trojans, defending the city of the goddess of love. Zeus watched in silence, allowing the balance to sway, but never to break. When the Trojans gained ground, a divine hand would tilt the scales back toward the Greeks. When the Greeks grew too powerful, another god would intervene. And so, the war dragged on, not a glorious clash of armies, but a grinding stalemate, an endless cycle of hope and despair. At night, the Greek fires burned along the coast like a second constellation. The men sat around them, staring into the flames, thinking of home. They spoke of the wives and children they had left behind, of the palaces now empty, of the years slipping away. Many had forgotten what peace even felt like. For some, Troy had become their prison. For others, their only world. Inside the city, life continued in a strange rhythm. The markets opened, weddings were held, children were born. Life persisted behind the safety of those unyielding walls. But every family had lost someone. Every household lived in the shadow of the war. The women of Troy climbed the towers each morning to watch the fighting, praying for the return of their fathers, husbands, or sons. At night, the sound of mourning carried through the streets like the sea breeze. The longer the war went on, the less it resembled a quest for justice, and the more it became a habit of survival. Even Helen, the cause of it all, lived in quiet sorrow, caught between guilt and inevitability. She walked the ramparts beside Priam, the aged king, who pitied her rather than blamed her. "You are not the cause," he told her once. "It is the gods who have brought this upon us." And perhaps he was right. The endless stalemate tested every soul. The Greeks began to turn to desperate measures, raids, ambushes, deceit. They built siege engines and tried tunneling beneath the walls. Nothing worked. Troy stood unshaken, protected by its gods and its courage. Each failed assault deepened the Greeks' frustration, and with it, their cruelty. Cities near Troy were sacked and burned, their people enslaved, their temples desecrated. Yet even these victories brought no closer end. Among the Greeks, Odysseus watched and waited. He was not the strongest or the fiercest, but he was the most cunning. As the years wore on, he saw what others refused to see. That brute force would never take Troy. The war, he realized, had become a test of patience and mind rather than muscle. And still, the days bled into months, the months into years. Each side began to wonder whether the gods had abandoned them altogether. Prophets and seers offered conflicting visions. Some said Troy would fall, others that it would endure forever. The soldiers no longer cared for prophecy. They only cared for survival. This, then, was the state of the world. When the idea of the Trojan horse was born, a world suffocating under the weight of endless war, a world where heroes had become weary men and kings had grown desperate, a world ready to grasp at any solution, no matter how improbable or deceptive, if it could finally end the suffering. The stalemate was not just a pause in battle, It was the forge that tempered the minds of those who survived it. It stripped away illusion and pride, leaving behind only necessity. And in that crucible of exhaustion and despair, a new kind of weapon would be imagined, not one made of bronze or iron, but of imagination and trickery. It is often said that necessity is the mother of invention, and as the Greeks stared at the unbroken walls of Troy, their necessity was great indeed. The war that had begun for love had now become a monument to endurance, and its ending would require something the ancient world had never seen before. A lie so beautiful, so grand, that an entire city would welcome it through its own gates. In every age of war, there comes a moment when strength alone ceases to matter, when victory belongs not to the fiercest warrior, but to the one who can outthink the rest. In the long and bitter struggle for Troy, that man was Odysseus, king of Ithaca. To understand how the Trojan horse came to be, we must first understand him, the mind that imagined it, the cunning that carried it into being, and the quiet patience of a man who understood that wit could wound more deeply than any blade. Odysseus was not the largest or strongest among the Greek kings. He did not possess the unstoppable fury of Achilles or the towering might of Ajax. His kingdom, Ithaca, was small and rocky, far from the great palaces of Mycenae or Sparta. But what Odysseus lacked in size, he compensated for in intellect. From his youth, he was known as a man who could unravel any riddle, who could see 10 moves ahead while others were still preparing their first. The ancients said Athena herself favored him, for the goddess of wisdom admired those who used their minds as weapons. When the call to arms first spread across Greece, Odysseus had tried to avoid the war altogether. He had just married Penelope, and his son, Telemachus, was a newborn. The last thing he wanted was to leave his home to fight over another man's wife. To escape the oath that bound all Helen's suitors, Odysseus pretended to be mad. He yoked a donkey and an ox together to plow his fields and sowed the furrows with salt instead of seed. But his act did not fool Palamedes, another clever Greek, who tested his madness by placing baby Telemachus in front of the plow. Odysseus swerved to avoid his child, revealing his sanity and sealing his fate. From that moment, he was bound to the war. During the years of siege, Odysseus became one of the Greek army's most valuable minds. He was not only a strategist, but also a diplomat, an inventor, and a master manipulator of men and circumstances. When Achilles refused to fight, it was Odysseus who visited him in his tent, coaxing and reasoning. When the Greeks needed guidance, it was Odysseus who consulted the seers and interpreted their words. And when courage alone failed to bring results, it was Odysseus who sought another way. Yet, for all his wisdom, Odysseus was not immune to hardship. He had seen countless comrades fall. He had watched the pride of Greece wither beneath the walls of Troy. He had seen Agamemnon's arrogance, Achilles' rage, and Ajax's despair. He knew that even heroes could crumble under the weight of time. The war had drained not just their bodies, but their spirits. Every battle began to feel the same, futile, repetitive, meaningless. And in that endless repetition, Odysseus began to think differently. He started to see war not as a test of strength, but as a game of deception. The Greeks, he realized, had been fighting on Troy's terms for too long, attacking walls that would never fall, challenging warriors who never tired of defending their home. To break the cycle, something unprecedented was needed, something so unexpected that it would bypass the very logic of war. Odysseus's genius lay in his ability to step outside convention. Where others saw enemies, he saw opportunities. Where others saw defeat, he saw the chance to learn. He understood that the mind of an enemy could be more fragile than stone walls. That belief could be a weapon more powerful than any spear. The Trojans trusted their gods, their city, and their own pride. Odysseus understood that if he could turn those strengths into weaknesses, Troy could be undone from within. There were whispers in the Greek camp that Odysseus had begun speaking of a different kind of victory. His ideas seemed strange at first. After 10 years of battle, men found it difficult to imagine anything but force. But Odysseus was persuasive. He had a way of speaking that made even the impossible sound logical. And when he spoke, he did not promise glory through slaughter, but peace through cunning. Many of his fellow kings respected him, though some distrusted his methods. To them, deception was dishonorable, but Odysseus believed that honor without victory was hollow. He once said, "A lie told for peace is nobler than a truth that leads to endless war." In his mind, trickery was not cowardice. It was strategy refined to its purest form. Odysseus had already proven his cleverness many times. He had stolen sacred relics from Troy's allies to weaken them. He had captured spies, infiltrated enemy camps, and manipulated rival kings to keep the alliance from collapsing. But now, as the war dragged toward its hopeless end, his mind reached for something far bolder, something that could end it all. According to some ancient sources, Odysseus began to study the behavior of the Trojans themselves. He watched from a distance as they celebrated small victories, as they prayed to Athena for protection, as they placed absolute faith in the signs of the gods. He understood that Troy's strength was not just its walls, but its faith, its unshakable belief that it was favored by the divine, and it was that very faith that could be used against them. The brilliance of Odysseus was not simply that he could think of a trick, but that he could imagine how his enemies would think about it. He could build not only a plan, but the illusion that would make that plan believable. Every step of his coming idea would depend on predicting human behavior. The pride of the Trojans, the exhaustion of the Greeks, the will of the gods. He knew that if even one detail seemed out of place, the ruse would fail. But if it worked, the war would be over. In this way, Odysseus embodied a different kind of heroism, one that the ancient world both admired and feared. He was the hero who used the mind instead of the sword, who could manipulate destiny through imagination rather than brute force. Some said Athena whispered the plan directly into his ear, that the goddess herself guided his thoughts. Others believed it was simply human genius, proof that the cleverness of man could rival even divine will. Odysseus also understood risk. Every great deception carries danger, and he knew the Trojan plan could just as easily destroy the Greeks as save them. If discovered, those hidden within the wooden horse would die without honor, their names lost. But for Odysseus, the alternative was worse. Another decade of meaningless fighting, another generation lost to stubborn pride. The mind of Odysseus was a storm of calculation and conviction. He was both dreamer and realist, philosopher and warrior. In him, the Greek spirit of cunning, métis, as the ancients called it, reached its purest form. It was said that he could bend truth the way a blacksmith bends iron, reshaping it until it fit his purpose perfectly. And though many distrusted him, even the proudest kings could not deny that his ideas often succeeded where swords had failed. By the time the seeds of the Trojan horse began to take shape in his imagination, Odysseus had already accepted that victory would not come through might, but through illusion. He saw the battlefield not as a place of strength, but as a stage, one on which the Greeks and Trojans had played their parts long enough. It was time to change the script. And so, as the weary army slept and the fires burned low across the shore, Odysseus's mind remained awake. He envisioned a plan that would end the war without another day of fighting, a plan that would turn the arrogance of Troy against itself. The world would remember Achilles for his strength, Hector for his honor, but it would remember Odysseus for his mind. The spark of great ideas often emerges from despair. For the Greeks at Troy, the endless war had drained the last reserves of courage and hope. The beaches were littered with broken ships, charred remnants of old sieges, and the weary remnants of men who no longer remembered what home smelled like. Yet within that exhaustion, a single mind, Odysseus's mind, refused to sleep. It was there, amid the ashes of failure, that the most daring idea in ancient warfare was born, the idea of the Trojan horse. It did not come in a thunderclap of inspiration, but rather in slow realization. Odysseus had long understood that force could no longer achieve what deception might. The Greeks had tried every method known to man: siege engines, secret tunnels, direct assaults, even divine pleas. But Troy had held firm. To conquer a city that had withstood 10 years of fury, he would need to think not like a warrior, but like a storyteller. Because to fool the Trojans, he would first need to give them a story they could believe. He thought deeply about what the Trojans valued most. They were a proud people, civilized, deeply religious, and convinced that their victory would come not merely through strength, but through the favor of the gods. Odysseus understood that the human heart, once convinced it acts under divine will, becomes blind to reason, and so he sought to create something that would appear not as a trick, but as an offering, a sacred gift that would invite the Trojans to destroy themselves. The inspiration may have come from the very animals that stood alongside the Greek warriors in battle. Horses were symbols of power, grace, and nobility throughout the ancient world. To the Trojans, and especially to their god Poseidon, the horse held particular meaning. Poseidon was not only lord of the seas, but also the creator of horses, an association of strength and movement, of natural majesty. In both Greek and Trojan culture, the horse was a divine creature, a gift from the gods themselves. And what better symbol for peace or for surrender than a magnificent wooden horse left behind by retreating Greeks? Odysseus's idea began to form. What if the Greeks appeared to abandon the war altogether, leaving behind a colossal horse as a tribute to Troy's endurance? It would be a statement of defeat disguised as reverence. The Trojans would see not a trap, but a miracle, a symbol that the gods had finally rewarded their patience. It would flatter their pride, feed their faith, and lull them into carelessness. And inside that very symbol of peace, Greek warriors could be hidden, ready to strike once the gates were opened. The audacity of the concept was breathtaking. No one had ever attempted something like it before. The risk was absolute. The plan required trust, timing, craftsmanship, and above all, silence. The Greeks would need to vanish from the shores convincingly. The Trojans would need to believe in their victory. The wooden horse itself would need to be so convincing, so magnificent, that no one would dare question it. Some say that Odysseus shared his idea first with Epius, a master craftsman known for his skill with wood and tools. Epius had been trained by Athena herself, the goddess of wisdom and craftsmanship. When Odysseus approached him with his vision, Epius at first thought it madness. A horse large enough to conceal soldiers within it? How could such a thing even stand? But Odysseus spoke with calm conviction, describing not only the form, but the meaning behind it. The horse, he explained, was not merely a vessel, it was a symbol. Every line, every curve, every plank of wood would carry purpose. Epeius, intrigued and challenged, agreed to help. From there, the idea spread quietly among the Greek leaders. Some were skeptical, even furious. Menelaus, still burning for vengeance, found it dishonorable. Ajax, the great warrior, scoffed. He preferred the clarity of combat to the uncertainty of deceit, but others saw the truth of it. Agamemnon, worn and desperate to bring his men home, gave his blessing. Nestor, the wise old king, called it a strategy worthy of the gods themselves. And so, the Greeks began their greatest deception, not with swords drawn, but with hammers and chisels. The design of the horse was deliberate. Its head was raised high, its posture noble and almost divine. Its surface was smoothed and polished, as if meant for the gaze of kings. Within, hidden compartments were carefully constructed, enough to hold dozens of the best warriors, Odysseus among them. A concealed hatch would allow them to emerge once inside the city. Every beam of timber, every joint and nail had to be perfectly placed. One miscalculation could reveal everything. Odysseus's mind guided the details. He insisted that the horse appear slightly weathered, as though built from the remnants of the Greek ships, symbolic of the fleet's dismantling and departure. To reinforce the illusion, a few soldiers were chosen to remain behind, men who would pretend to have been left behind by their retreating comrades, offering the story that the horse was an offering to Athena to ensure safe passage home. This narrative, Odysseus knew, would be irresistible to the Trojans. It appealed to their pride and to their piety in equal measure. Every deception requires an audience that wants to believe, and Odysseus understood this principle better than any man alive. The Trojans, exhausted yet jubilant, wanted to believe the war was over. They wanted to believe they had survived the impossible, and belief, once it takes root, grows faster than truth can chase it. It's worth pausing to appreciate how revolutionary this concept truly was. The Trojan horse was not merely a trick of war, it was the invention of psychological warfare itself. Odysseus turned human nature into his battlefield. He exploited faith, pride, and relief, the very emotions that make victory dangerous. It was the ultimate weapon, not of wood or steel, but of persuasion. In later centuries, philosophers and generals alike would cite Odysseus's plan as the pinnacle of cunning. It represented a new dimension of intelligence, one that saw war not as the domination of bodies, but of minds. And though some condemned it as deceitful, the fact remained. It was an idea so powerful that even the gods, if they were watching, must have smiled at its daring simplicity. When the Greeks gathered for one final council before building began, Odysseus spoke quietly but firmly. He reminded them that their strength had failed them, but their wits had not. Victory, he said, is not always won by the loudest cry or the strongest arm. Sometimes it belongs to the quietest whisper, to the idea that no one sees coming. And so, on the shores of Troy, as dawn broke over the Aegean Sea, the Greeks began to construct the most famous artifact in the history of warfare. The hammering of nails replaced the clashing of swords. The scraping of wood echoed like the murmuring of fate. Piece by piece, the horse began to rise, majestic and ominous, a silent promise that the end of the war was near. Few among the Greeks could truly comprehend what was being born before them. To them, it was a gamble, an act of desperation. But to Odysseus, it was something more. It was the embodiment of human ingenuity, the belief that the mind could achieve what muscle could not. He watched the horse take shape with calm certainty, knowing that within its hollow belly lay not only warriors, but destiny itself. The vision of Odysseus had been clear. The Greeks would not win Troy with brute force alone. They needed a weapon of cunning, a vessel of deception, and a symbol so magnificent that it would trick the Trojans into inviting it within their walls. That weapon was the wooden horse, a creation that would require not only ingenuity, but patience, skill, and meticulous craftsmanship. To understand the sheer audacity of the plan, one must first step into the workshops of the Greek army and witness the labor that brought the legendary horse to life. At first, the task seemed impossible. The Greeks had spent a decade fighting, not building. Their camp along the Aegean coast was littered with remnants of war, shattered shields, broken spears, and splintered ships. Timber was scarce, tools were weathered from years of use, and the soldiers themselves were exhausted. Yet under the guidance of Odysseus and the master craftsman Epeus, the army began what would become the most iconic piece of military engineering in mythological history. The first step was design. The horse needed to be massive, imposing, and above all, believable. It had to appear as a tribute to Athena, a gift worthy of the goddess, and yet large enough to hold dozens of warriors within. Epeus drew careful plans, considering every joint, beam, and plank. The frame would be hollow, but structurally sound, able to bear the weight of its own height and the men concealed within. Every piece of timber was measured, carved, and tested. The Greeks used the strongest woods they could find, reinforced at critical points, ensuring that the horse would not collapse under its own weight. Construction began with the skeleton. Massive beams were lashed together to form the sturdy frame of the horse's legs and torso. The Greeks worked tirelessly, cutting, chiseling, and fitting the pieces as the days passed. The sheer scale of the horse was daunting. It towered above most men, its neck stretching skyward, its head high and noble, carved to inspire awe rather than fear. Every plank had to align perfectly. One misstep could compromise the entire structure. Soldiers worked in shifts, sweating under the relentless sun, their hands blistered and calloused from a decade of war. Yet their determination never faltered. They understood that the success of the war now depended not on spears or swords, but on this wooden creation. As the skeleton took shape, attention turned to the details. The Greeks smoothed every surface, carved lines into the wood to resemble musculature, and fashioned a mane that seemed almost alive in its flowing curves. They polished the exterior, giving the horse a sheen that reflected the morning sun, and even painted it with oils and resins to preserve it against moisture. Inside, compartments were meticulously arranged to hold the soldiers. Each hiding place was carefully measured to allow men to sit without being cramped, yet remain completely concealed. Air vents were subtle, enough to allow breathing without betraying the presence within. Odysseus insisted on one key feature above all. The horse must look abandoned, a gift left in surrender. To achieve this, the Greeks added subtle marks of wear, as if the horse had been constructed hastily from the remains of their fleet. Tools left behind, scratches in the wood, and even minor damage along its flanks created the illusion of a hurried creation. It was a deception not only in function, but in narrative. When the Trojans eventually found it, they would see not a trap, but a trophy, a sign that the Greeks had given up and departed. Hippias oversaw every detail, moving between the soldiers and the design plans, correcting errors and refining the structure. The Greeks had never built anything on this scale before, yet necessity drove them to exceed all prior skill. The hammering of nails echoed across the beach, a rhythmic percussion that blended with the lapping waves, as if the sea itself bore witness to the birth of legend. Wood shavings littered the sand, and the air smelled of pine resin and sweat, a tangible testament to human ingenuity under extreme pressure. The size of the horse presented unique challenges. Its height and weight made movement difficult. The Greeks needed to construct it in sections, assembling the legs, torso, and head separately before finally joining them together. Ingenious scaffolding and ropes allowed workers to lift the pieces safely, while small teams inside the skeleton ensured that each beam was perfectly aligned. There was a delicate balance between stability and concealment. The structure had to be strong enough to support its own weight and the soldiers inside, yet hollow enough to hide them completely. As the horse neared completion, Odysseus's mind turned to the next challenge: perception. It was not enough for the horse to exist. It had to convey meaning. Every curve, every proportion, every feature was carefully designed to suggest reverence, peace, and submission. Its neck was elongated, as if bowing slightly, and its head was noble, yet passive, inviting admiration rather than suspicion. To the Trojans, it would not appear as a weapon, but as an offering, a divine tribute to their endurance. The final touches were added with painstaking care. The interior compartments were lined with mats and ropes, giving soldiers a small degree of comfort during the long wait they would endure inside. The exterior received a final polish. Subtle carvings depicting Greek gods and symbols of victory, and the delicate addition of an impression of wear and age. By the time it was finished, the horse had transformed from raw timber into a monumental statement of cunning, patience, and art. Throughout the process, Odysseus observed quietly, offering suggestions and adjustments where needed. He understood that the success of the horse relied as much on belief as on construction. If the Trojans suspected a trick, the plan would fail. The horse had to inspire awe, curiosity, and ultimately, trust. It was a combination of engineering, psychology, and art, a weapon of the mind as much as of wood. When the final beam was secured and the structure stood complete, the Greeks stepped back and marveled at their creation. The horse towered above them, majestic and imposing, a perfect blend of practicality and deception. For the first time in 10 years, hope stirred among the exhausted soldiers. They had a plan, a tool, a chance to end the stalemate that had gripped both armies in exhaustion and frustration. The wooden giant was more than a piece of military engineering. It was a testament to human ingenuity, a triumph of intellect over brute force, and a physical embodiment of the idea that victory could be achieved through strategy and deception rather than only bloodshed. The Trojans, of course, did not yet know it, but this magnificent horse would become the instrument that decided the fate of their city, the vessel that would deliver both salvation and doom, and the symbol that would echo through history for millennia. Building the wooden horse was only the first step. Even the most magnificent creation would mean nothing if the men inside it were not carefully chosen. The success of the Trojan horse depended not only on craftsmanship, but on the courage, skill, and discipline of those who would hide within it. These were men who would need to endure darkness, silence, and the constant tension of waiting, knowing that discovery meant certain death. Odysseus, who had conceived the plan, understood this better than anyone. Selecting the right warriors was as critical as constructing the horse itself. The first consideration was courage. The soldiers chosen to hide inside the horse would be trapped in close quarters, unable to move freely, and forced to remain silent for hours or even days, while the Trojans examined their prize. Panic would be fatal. Only men of exceptional composure could endure the confinement without compromising the entire operation. These were warriors accustomed to both the chaos of battle and the patience of siege warfare. They had fought for years, seen friends fall beside them, and survived when lesser men might have fled. Their bravery was matched only by their discipline. Odysseus's choices also reflected the need for cunning and adaptability. While the horse itself was a trap, the men inside would be required to act decisively the moment it was brought into Troy. They needed to emerge quickly, strike efficiently, and take advantage of any opportunity. The Greeks needed soldiers who could think on their feet, not just follow orders. For this reason, Odysseus personally selected a team that included his most trusted lieutenants, men whose loyalty was unquestioned and whose minds were as sharp as their blades. Among the chosen warriors were some of the finest soldiers remaining in the Greek army. Each man had proven himself in countless skirmishes, often displaying not only skill with weapons, but ingenuity in the field. Some were experts in ambush and stealth, able to move quietly and strike without warning. Others were veterans of the Trojan plains, intimately familiar with the city's defenses and the habits of its defenders. Together, they formed a unit designed for precision, flexibility, and absolute secrecy. The process of selection was as deliberate as the construction of the horse itself. Odysseus held private councils with his closest allies, weighing the strengths, weaknesses, and personalities of every potential candidate. Some men were rejected, not for lack of skill, but for temperament. Even a single man prone to panic could ruin the entire plan. The selected warriors were then briefed in detail. They were instructed on how to enter the horse, how to remain silent, how to use their weapons once the time came, and how to escape if the situation turned against them. Every contingency was considered, every risk analyzed. Discipline was essential. The men chosen had to remain motionless for hours as the Trojans inspected the horse, lifted it, and paraded it into the city. They would endure darkness, suffocating heat, and the eerie quiet, all while knowing that discovery would mean instant death. Odysseus understood human psychology intimately. He knew that even the strongest warrior could falter under such conditions. Training sessions were held within mock compartments, teaching the men to remain calm, to breathe slowly, and to communicate silently through subtle signals if needed. The ability to control fear was as important as mastery of sword or spear. Trust was equally vital. These men would not only be hiding together, but their survival depended on mutual cooperation. There could be no doubt that each warrior would follow orders to the letter, that no one would attempt to escape prematurely, and that every action would align with the plan. Odysseus selected men whose loyalty was absolute, often veterans who had shared long campaigns and understood the stakes. Betrayal was not merely dangerous, it was unthinkable. Among the chosen was Odysseus himself. The genius behind the plan would not send others into danger without placing himself at the heart of it. He understood that his presence would provide both guidance and reassurance. The other warriors drew courage from his calm, unwavering demeanor. It was a psychological advantage as much as a tactical one. The men inside the horse were not merely hiding, they were carrying the embodiment of their plan, guided by the mind that conceived it. The warriors were also chosen for their versatility. Once inside the city, they would need to act quickly and decisively. Some carried weapons suited for close combat. Others were skilled with short-range tactics to neutralize guards. Odysseus made certain that no skill was overlooked. They had men capable of opening gates, disabling reinforcements, and coordinating with the Greek army waiting outside. Timing was everything. The horse would deliver the men to the city gates, but the opening blow would be their responsibility. Each warrior was prepared for every possible scenario, and every action had been rehearsed in secret. Morale played a crucial role as well. Despite the danger, the men chosen had to embrace the plan wholeheartedly. Fear could have been contagious, but Odysseus instilled in them a sense of purpose and inevitability. He reminded them that the war had lasted 10 years and that this single mission could end it forever. This was not merely survival, it was glory. It was the opportunity to achieve what strength alone had failed to accomplish. The soldiers entered the horse not as prisoners, but as participants in a decisive stroke of genius. Finally, there was the human element of endurance. The warriors would endure confinement that would test even the most seasoned soldier. They had to remain still for extended periods, sometimes hearing the footsteps and voices of the very men they had fought against, listening to the Trojans' excitement and curiosity, and resisting the urge to reveal themselves prematurely. Odysseus ensured that their spirits were prepared, training them to control not only their bodies, but their minds, to remain calm under immense psychological pressure. By the time the horse was ready for its journey to Troy, the warriors selected were not simply soldiers, they were an elite unit honed for one purpose: to emerge at the perfect moment and turn deception into victory. Each man knew the risks, understood the stakes, and trusted both the plan and their comrades implicitly. Their courage, discipline, and loyalty were as vital to the success of the Trojan horse as its wooden frame. The combination of the horse's construction and the careful selection of its hidden warriors represented a singular fusion of intellect, skill, and strategy. It was a plan unlike anything the ancient world had seen. Engineering, psychology, and military precision united in one audacious stroke. The Greeks were about to attempt not just a raid or a siege, but an act of genius in which the courage and restraint of a few men would determine the fate of an entire city. As the warriors settled into their hidden compartments, preparing for the most dangerous moment of their lives, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. The horse, now complete and fully armed with its human cargo, waited silently on the shore. Outside, the Greek army feigned retreat, leaving the beaches eerily empty, as if surrendering to the inevitable. Inside the horse, Odysseus and his men prepared themselves for history. By the time the wooden horse stood completed on the sands of Troy, the Greek army faced its final challenge, making their retreat believable. The greatest trick of the Trojan horse relied not just on the construction of the wooden colossus or the courage of the men hidden within, but on convincing the Trojans that the Greeks had abandoned the siege entirely. The illusion had to be flawless. Every detail of the Greek departure meticulously orchestrated, every observation of the Trojans anticipated. Failure was unthinkable, for any doubt on the part of the Trojans could unravel 10 years of planning in an instant. Odysseus oversaw the operation with the calm authority of a man who understood both the psychology of the enemy and the stakes of the moment. The retreat itself was a performance, a staged drama designed to appear spontaneous and genuine. Ships were quietly loaded with warriors not selected for the horse, who would sail away along the coastline to create the impression of a full-scale withdrawal. Fires along the Greek camp were dimmed, tents were packed, and the camp itself was gradually emptied. From a distance, it appeared as if the Greeks had finally conceded defeat, leaving the field to Troy's defenders. Yet the retreat was more than mere appearances. It was a calculated risk. The Greeks knew that some Trojans might still be suspicious, that some might consider the departure too convenient, too clean. To counter this, Odysseus introduced small errors into the performance, subtle imperfections designed to make the Trojans believe the Greeks' departure was real. A few abandoned weapons were left behind, tents left partially open, and minor pieces of armor scattered along the beach, as if in haste or carelessness. These tiny details, intended to mimic human imperfection, lent credibility to the deception. The timing of the retreat was also critical. The Greeks waited for the Trojans to notice their absence before attempting the final act. Once the city's walls were unclenched and the defenders had lowered their guard, the horse could be presented as a gift, a tribute left behind in surrender, a symbol of peace and respect. Odysseus understood that the Trojans' emotions were their greatest vulnerability. Exhausted from 10 years of war, many of them longed to believe that the fighting was finally over. They desired a conclusion that would affirm their endurance, their cleverness, and above all, the favor of their gods. The Greeks' retreat fed directly into that desire. To further cement the illusion, a few Greek soldiers remained in hiding along the coast, visible to the Trojans from a distance. They were stationed in small, isolated groups, ensuring that the city's defenders could catch sight of scouts or remnants of the army sailing away. These men acted as silent witnesses to the Greek departure, confirming the story that Troy had survived, that the siege was over, and that the Greeks had abandoned their efforts entirely. It was a subtle, psychological reinforcement. The Trojans would see with their own eyes what their hearts wanted to believe. At the same time, Odysseus prepared a narrative to explain the horse itself. It would be described as an offering to Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, intended to secure safe passage for the Greeks as they returned home. The story suggested that the horse was a token of gratitude, left in admiration of Troy's formidable defenses and as a symbol of reconciliation. To any Trojan who questioned its purpose, the narrative provided a ready explanation. It was a gift from the gods, blessed and sacred, designed to honor the city rather than destroy it. The presentation of the horse was choreographed with meticulous attention to detail. While the main Greek fleet sailed out of view, teams of soldiers pushed the horse carefully toward the gates of Troy. Its size and weight made the task difficult, requiring coordinated effort to maneuver it without damage. As it approached the city, the Trojans gathered to witness what appeared to be the Greeks' final gesture, a surrender rendered in wood. The horse towered over the onlookers, impressive and majestic, a monument to Greek craftsmanship and cunning that would seem impossible to replicate. The Trojans, exhausted and emboldened by the apparent retreat, welcomed the horse with both awe and curiosity. Some suggested destroying it immediately, but the majority were swayed by the story of divine purpose. Priests and elders interpreted the horse as a gift from Athena herself, a sign that the city had earned her favor and that the Greeks had accepted their defeat. Their pride and hope blinded them to the possibility of treachery. It was precisely the combination of fatigue, desire, and faith that Odysseus had anticipated. The Trojans wanted to believe, and that desire made them complicit in their own downfall. Even within Troy, there were those who warned against the horse. Some soldiers, warriors trained to see through deception, suspected a trick. Laocoon, the Trojan priest, famously cautioned that the Greeks had not simply abandoned the siege and that the horse might hide danger. But doubt was not enough to overcome collective belief. Persuasive arguments from those invested in the hope of peace, combined with the seeming logic of a sacred gift, silenced the skeptics. Odysseus had understood that in moments of psychological warfare, perception often outweighs reason. The Trojans' trust in their interpretation of the event sealed the success of the ruse. Meanwhile, inside the horse, the Greek warriors remained still, their muscles aching from hours of immobility, their senses heightened with anticipation. They listened to the murmur of the crowd, the laughter, the curiosity, and the excitement. Every step of the Trojans' examination, every sound of the gates opening, every exclamation of awe confirmed that the deception was succeeding. The men inside waited in silence, knowing that the success of the plan depended on their patience as much as on the construction or the performance outside. The Greek retreat and the accompanying deception illustrate the genius of Odysseus's strategy. Victory was achieved not through force, but through psychology, timing, and control of narrative. Every element, from the meticulous crafting of the horse to the carefully staged withdrawal, was designed to manipulate perception, exploiting the desires and beliefs of the enemy. It was a masterclass in strategic thinking, demonstrating that sometimes the greatest weapon is not a sword or spear, but a story that convinces your opponent to act against their own interest. By the time the horse stood within the gates of Troy, the plan was almost complete. The city's defenders were convinced of Greek surrender. The streets of Troy, usually tense with vigilance, buzzed with curiosity and relief. The psychological battlefield had already been won. The Greeks outside the walls waited for nightfall, for the moment when their plan would transition from deception to action. And inside the horse, the men prepared to emerge as the instrument of destiny, ready to turn 10 years of siege into a single night of irreversible triumph. The Greek retreat had set the stage, and the wooden horse now stood within sight of Troy's towering walls, a silent monument to both ingenuity and danger. From the moment the Trojans first glimpsed it, their curiosity was immediate and irresistible. For 10 long years, they had endured siege, bloodshed, and the constant fear of defeat. Now, suddenly, this enormous wooden horse appeared before them, a symbol of peace, a trophy of their perseverance, and unbeknownst to them, a vessel of doom. How they reacted in those first moments would determine the fate of their entire city. The initial reaction among the Trojans was awe. The horse's sheer size and craftsmanship stunned them. Its head rose high above their city walls, its form noble and imposing. Carvings on its surface seemed to shimmer in the sunlight, depicting scenes of Greek heroes and gods, and polished wood reflected the blue of the sky like the sea itself. To many Trojans, it seemed more than a gift. It appeared divine. It was not merely an object, it was a statement, an offering worthy of their gods, and a tribute to Troy's unmatched endurance. Even as admiration spread, curiosity sparked debate. Some of Troy's defenders argued that the horse was a ruse, a clever trap set by the Greeks to conceal soldiers within its hollow belly. Laocoon, a Trojan priest and a figure of caution, famously warned that trusting such a gift was foolish. Beware of Greeks bearing gifts, he declared, invoking a proverb that has survived through millennia. He urged the city to destroy the horse immediately, to burn it or dismantle it before any Greek hand could emerge. Yet Laocoon's warning was drowned by hope and pride. The Trojans had been at war for a decade. Their walls had withstood countless assaults. Their soldiers had faced the mightiest warriors of Greece and survived. The arrival of the horse coincided with the sudden departure of the Greek army, which they interpreted as a miraculous sign of victory. Exhaustion, combined with the intoxicating mix of relief and triumph, made many Trojans unwilling to consider deception. They wanted to believe that their city had earned the favor of the gods, that the Greeks had acknowledged their indomitable strength, and that this wooden horse was proof of divine intervention. The psychological tension was palpable. For days, the Trojans debated the horse's fate. Some were cautious, suggesting that it be dismantled outside the walls, that its interior be searched carefully. Others were swept up by excitement, insisting it be brought into the city as a symbol of their triumph. The elders consulted diviners, priests, and seers, all of whom interpreted the horse as sacred, meant to honor Athena and ensure Troy's prosperity. The collective need to believe overrode the logical suspicion that some soldiers still felt. Eventually, pride and desire won over caution. To the majority, the horse was not a threat, but a trophy, an opportunity to display both reverence and celebration. It was a test of perception as much as of wisdom's. The Trojans believed that bringing it inside would demonstrate their courage, their intelligence, and their favor with the gods. It was the perfect human combination: curiosity, hope, and arrogance, each exploited by the Greeks with meticulous precision. Moving the horse into the city was no simple task. Its massive size required careful coordination, ropes, and pulleys to maneuver it through the gates without damage. The Trojans, eager to witness the spectacle, cheered as the horse was drawn inside. Children and elders crowded the streets to see it, and for a moment the city celebrated as if the war had truly ended. The very act of bringing it through the gates was symbolic. They believed themselves victorious, yet in reality, they were delivering their own undoing. Inside the city, the atmosphere shifted. The horse was placed in the central square, where its presence dominated the surrounding buildings. To many, it was awe-inspiring, a symbol of triumph carved in wood. Statues and temples seemed smaller in comparison, and for the first time in a decade, Troy felt as if it had won. The Trojans danced, feasted, and praised their survival. The air was filled with excitement, laughter, and a sense of divine favor. Every cheer, every gesture, unknowingly validated Odysseus's plan. Even as celebration continued, few cautious voices remained. Some soldiers and advisors urged caution, recalling Laocoon's warnings. They proposed guarding the horse, surrounding it with sentries, or even partially dismantling it. But the majority dismissed these warnings, too enraptured by pride and relief to consider danger. It was a classic example of human psychology. When hope and desire overwhelm rational thought, even the most obvious risks can be ignored. Odysseus had anticipated this precisely, crafting a scenario in which the Trojans' own emotions would lead them to make the fatal decision. Inside the horse, the Greek warriors remained still, every muscle tense, every breath controlled. They could hear the footsteps of the Trojans, the laughter and chatter as people inspected the horse, and the faint murmurs of debate about its purpose. It was an agonizing exercise in patience. The men knew that any noise, any mistake, could betray them and ruin the plan. Yet they also understood the stakes, the success of their mission, and the end of the 10-year war depended on their ability to endure, silent and hidden, while the Trojans acted exactly as Odysseus had predicted. The psychological power of the moment cannot be overstated. The Trojans' desire to believe in their victory, their fascination with the horse, and their eagerness to celebrate became the very tools by which the Greeks would claim triumph. It was a moment in which perception outweighed reality, in which human hope and pride were weaponized with devastating precision. By allowing themselves to be guided by emotion rather than reason, the Trojans completed the final phase of Odysseus's plan. The decision to bring the horse inside the city was made in triumph and excitement. To the Trojans, it marked the end of 10 years of siege, a moment of victory and divine blessing. They had succeeded in surviving against the mightiest army of Greece. They had demonstrated their resilience and wisdom, and yet, in doing so, they had unknowingly invited the instrument of their own destruction into the heart of Troy. In that moment, the stage was set. The city celebrated. The Greeks waited silently within the horse, and the night of destiny approached. The combination of the Trojans' curiosity, desire, and misplaced trust had aligned perfectly with Odysseus's plan. The horse, magnificent and seemingly innocent, now stood at the center of a city on the brink of collapse. What followed would transform myth, history, and the concept of war itself. The day had faded, and the sun sank below the horizon, casting Troy in shades of gold and shadow. The city, oblivious to the danger within its walls, buzzed with celebration and curiosity. The Trojan citizens, their pride and relief swelling after 10 long years of siege, had welcomed the wooden horse into their midst. They marveled at its size, its craftsmanship, and the supposed gift of peace it represented. Little did they know that the night would soon transform from a moment of triumph into a theater of disaster. As darkness fell, the atmosphere shifted. The vibrant chatter of the city gradually softened, replaced by the subtle sounds of footsteps, distant conversations, and the occasional laughter of those who still lingered outside the horse. The Greek warriors concealed within the hollow wooden giant were tense, their senses heightened by the knowledge that their fate and the fate of the war hinged entirely on patience, silence, and timing. Every movement, every breath had to be controlled. Any noise could betray their presence and doom the mission. Odysseus, ever the strategist, had planned for every eventuality. The men inside the horse were trained to remain absolutely still, yet alert, listening to the rhythm of the city outside. They knew that the Trojans' guards would patrol the streets, that a stray footstep could approach the wooden colossus at any moment, and that vigilance was paramount. They had practiced in mock compartments, enduring hours of immobility, and now the trial of truth had arrived. The patience they had honed would determine success or failure. Outside, the Trojans continued to prepare for what they believed would be a night of celebration. They constructed altars, lit small fires to honor their perceived victory, and sent some of their youngest and most curious citizens to explore the horse, inspecting its details with fascination. Their pride was evident. They had survived, and the Greeks had seemingly retreated. The idea of danger had not yet crossed the majority of minds. Suspicion, though voiced by a few cautious figures, had been largely drowned out by collective hope and excitement. As the night deepened, the Trojans began to relax their vigilance. Guards patrolled less rigorously, and the laughter of children and the soft music of celebration filled the streets. In every corner of the city, the sense of triumph was palpable. The Greeks outside Troy had vanished beyond the horizon, their ships hidden by darkness, leaving the Trojans to believe they had truly achieved a miraculous victory. And yet, the true danger was quietly, patiently, and immovably waiting within the wooden horse. Inside, the Greek warriors began to make small preparations for the moment they would strike. Weapons were readied, armor adjusted, and every man positioned for rapid deployment once the city gates were opened. Odysseus remained calm, offering guidance through subtle gestures and quiet commands, ensuring that each warrior was ready to act at precisely the right moment. His presence was a source of discipline, a reminder that even the greatest deception required execution with absolute precision. The timing of the night's events was crucial. The Greeks had calculated the hour when the Trojans would be least alert, late into the night, when exhaustion and intoxication would dull judgment. The city's inhabitants would be celebrating, sleeping, or distracted, making them vulnerable to surprise. Every moment of delay or premature action could jeopardize the operation. The tension inside the horse was intense, yet controlled. The men were acutely aware that restraint now would lead to triumph later. Meanwhile, the Trojans continued to debate the horse's significance. Some still whispered caution, recalling warnings from Laocoon and other prudent figures. Others dismissed these fears as outdated or overly cautious, convinced that the horse represented divine favor and victory. The tension between hope and suspicion created a perfect environment for deception, a city caught between two emotions, leaning overwhelmingly toward the one Odysseus had anticipated. The Greeks had relied not just on the Trojans' curiosity, but on their desire to believe, knowing that human psychology could be as decisive as any weapon. The night's darkness provided the perfect cover. Shadows stretched across the walls and streets, softening outlines and masking movements. The horse itself became a silent sentinel, towering over the city, concealing the men within while projecting an aura of harmless reverence. To the Trojans, it was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, an object of admiration. To the Greeks inside, it was a vessel of destiny, holding the key to ending a war that had already lasted 10 long, exhausting years. As the city fell deeper into night, small groups of Trojans began to leave their homes and approach the horse more closely. They ran fingers along the polished wood, whispered to one another about its size and design, and speculated on its meaning. The Greeks inside could hear the excitement, the curiosity, the awe, all of which validated the plan. Every sound, every gesture, every cautious approach reinforced the illusion that Troy had survived, that the Greeks had conceded, and that the wooden horse was nothing more than a gift of celebration and gratitude. The Greek warriors waited, knowing that the moment to act had not yet arrived. Even the slightest premature move could alert the Trojans. Patience, they knew, was as critical as courage. Their training and discipline, honed over 10 years of war, would now determine the outcome. The men had been selected not only for their skill in combat, but for their ability to endure in extreme conditions. And now they were tested to the fullest. The night was both ally and adversary, a cover for their action, yet a silent witness to the tension that could unravel in a heartbeat. As the hours passed, the Trojans finally began to relax completely, their vigilance dulled by exhaustion and celebration. The city's gates were secured in a state of complacency, the watchmen distracted, and the majority of the inhabitants absorbed in their own sense of triumph. This was the exact moment Odysseus had envisioned, the culmination of years of planning, the point at which the Greeks' audacious scheme would begin its final, irreversible phase. The night of the deception had begun. Every aspect, the horse's construction, the careful selection of warriors, the staged Greek retreat, and the psychological manipulation of the Trojans had aligned perfectly. What followed would transform the city of Troy, redefine the concept of strategy, and forever enshrine the ingenuity of Odysseus in the annals of myth and history. The stage was set for the greatest act of cunning the ancient world had ever seen, and the final hours of Troy's unsuspecting citizens were now ticking down in silence. Within the hollow belly of the wooden horse, darkness reigned. The air was still, the shadows deep, and the only sounds were the controlled breaths of the Greek warriors concealed inside. These men were the unseen forces of destiny, the silent instruments of a plan that would end 10 years of siege. While the city above celebrated, the warriors waited, each aware that the slightest mistake could turn their hidden sanctuary into a tomb. It was a test of courage, patience, and discipline, unlike any they had experienced in battle. The selection of these men had been meticulous, designed to ensure that only those capable of withstanding extreme conditions would participate. Odysseus himself was among them, the mastermind of the plan, his presence a source of reassurance and guidance. The others included some of the finest soldiers remaining in the Greek army, men not only skilled in combat, but trained to endure physical discomfort, psychological tension, and the suffocating confinement of the horse. Each warrior had been carefully briefed, drilled in silence, and conditioned for the ordeal that now unfolded. Inside the horse, the environment was claustrophobic. The compartmented interior allowed for dozens of men to hide, but movement was severely restricted. They sat pressed together, their armor removed or adjusted to avoid sound, and their weapons at the ready, but carefully positioned to avoid detection. Air flowed through subtle vents, enough to sustain them for hours, but the heat and the humidity pressed heavily on their bodies. Every man was acutely aware of his own heartbeat, every shift of weight potentially betraying the entire operation. Despite these challenges, the warriors remained calm. Their training, discipline, and trust in Odysseus were paramount. They understood the stakes. The moment they emerged would determine the fall of Troy, and any failure within could doom the mission. They had been chosen for this task because they were not only brave, but intelligent, capable of acting decisively under extreme stress. Within the darkness of the horse, courage was not expressed through force or noise, but through stillness, patience, and precision. The psychological pressure was immense. Outside, the sounds of celebration, footsteps, laughter, and voices reached them muffled through the thick wood. The Trojans moved around the horse, inspecting it, discussing it, sometimes placing small offerings or making ritual gestures as they honored the supposed gift to Athena. The Greeks inside could hear every sound, and each one reminded them that discovery would be catastrophic. Yet the men had trained for this. They had rehearsed remaining perfectly still, breathing slowly, and controlling their impulses under prolonged tension. Every second that passed strengthened their discipline, proving their readiness for the moment of action. Odysseus understood that the human mind could be the greatest enemy in moments like these. Fear, anxiety, and impatience could easily lead to disasters. He moved silently among his men, offering reassurance and subtle signals of encouragement. He reminded them of the plan's timing, their positions, and the importance of restraint. Each warrior drew confidence from his presence, understanding that the calm mind of their leader was as vital as their own courage. Inside the horse, the unity of purpose and trust in leadership created an invisible shield against panic. The warriors also knew the element of surprise would be their greatest weapon. The Trojans, so confident in their perceived victory, had lowered their defenses, creating the perfect environment for the Greeks to strike. Every hour of silence inside the horse was preparation for that sudden, decisive moment. The men visualized the sequence of events, rehearsing in their minds the opening of the gates, the rush of combat, and the swift neutralization of key targets. This mental preparation was as critical as any physical readiness. The warriors were not only hidden, but mentally rehearsing the execution of their plan. While hidden, the Greek soldiers were also acutely aware of their historical significance. They understood that their actions would define the outcome of the war and create a story that would be told for generations. The tension within the horse was not merely a test of survival, it was a crucible in which the legacy of heroism, cunning, and ingenuity would be forged. Each man had to reconcile the fear of discovery with the knowledge that their patience and restraint could change history. Odysseus, always vigilant, used the time to coordinate and communicate silently with subtle gestures. He ensured that every man knew exactly when and where to act, and he reminded them that timing would be everything. The Greek warriors were like instruments in a symphony, each waiting for the precise moment when their collective effort would produce a single, harmonious, and devastating effect. Their unity and discipline inside the horse were as critical as its construction. Without perfect coordination, the plan would fail. The night continued, stretching into the deep hours when even the most vigilant city guards began to relax. The Trojans, fatigued from celebration and the emotional high of apparent victory, had begun to reduce their attention to the horse. Some left it unattended in the square, others touched it casually, and a few approached in groups to marvel at its size and craftsmanship. Every action confirmed that the deception was working, that Odysseus's predictions of human behavior were accurate, and that the warrior's patience would soon pay off. Inside the horse, anticipation grew. The Greeks were poised to transform from passive observers into active agents of destiny. They had endured physical discomfort, mental strain, and the fear of discovery, and now the moment of action approached. Their training, courage, and trust in Odysseus had kept them composed through the long hours. Soon, they would emerge from the darkness to change the fate of Troy forever. The unseen warriors, hidden within the wooden colossus, embodied the culmination of human ingenuity and discipline. They were more than soldiers. They were the instruments of strategy, the silent executors of a plan that combined engineering, psychology, and timing. Every heartbeat, every breath, every second of silence brought them closer to the moment when the city that had resisted Greece for 10 years would fall, not by force alone, but by the cunning patience and audacious planning of a few extraordinary men. The city of Troy slumbered, unaware that the culmination of 10 long years of war was about to unfold in its streets. The night had deepened, shadows stretched across the walls, and the Trojans, confident in their supposed victory, had largely let their guard down. The wooden horse stood silently in the city's heart, its hollow belly concealing the most dangerous presence the city had ever faced. Within, Odysseus and the chosen Greek warriors waited with the calm intensity of men who knew that history hinged on this single, decisive moment. The fall of Troy did not begin with clashing swords or the roar of battle. It began with silence, a calculated quiet that heightened the tension in every corner of the city. The Greeks inside the horse were acutely aware that their success depended on timing. They could not act until the city was most vulnerable, when the majority of defenders were distracted by sleep, celebration, or exhaustion. Each man took a deep, controlled breath, flexed muscles that had been still for hours, and prepared to emerge in the darkness, ready to execute the final phase of Odysseus's meticulously orchestrated plan. Outside, a few of the Trojans still lingered in the square, admiring the massive horse, touching its polished surfaces, and speculating about its purpose. They could not have known that, beneath their feet, men were silently poised for action. The city's gates remained partially unguarded, and the night's calm lulled even the most cautious sentries into a false sense of security. It was precisely the environment Odysseus had predicted, a city at ease, confident in its perceived triumph, and blind to the threat concealed within its walls. Finally, the moment arrived. Odysseus gave the subtle signal. and the warriors inside the horse sprang into action. They emerged with precision, silent yet deadly, slipping into the shadows of Troy's streets. Each man moved quickly, knowing that surprise was their greatest advantage. The first targets were the sentries and guards, neutralized swiftly and silently to prevent any alarm. The Greek warriors had been trained for stealth as much as for combat, and their actions reflected both preparation and ruthless efficiency. The Trojans, initially bewildered by the sudden appearance of armed Greeks from within their celebrated prize, struggled to react. Panic spread rapidly as the first clash of swords echoed through the streets. Confusion reigned. The city's defenders, overwhelmed by the unexpected assault, were unable to mount a coherent defense. The precision of the Greek warriors ensured that key points of the city, gates, armories, and strategic intersections, were secured quickly, allowing the remainder of the Greek forces to enter once alerted. Meanwhile, the Greek army, which had feigned retreat earlier, returned under the cover of darkness. Their approach was synchronized with the chaos within the city, ensuring that the Trojans faced threats from multiple directions simultaneously. This coordination amplified the effect of surprise and maximized the Greeks' advantage. Troy, which had seemed impenetrable for a decade, was now succumbing not to prolonged siege, but to audacious strategy and impeccable timing. The psychological impact on the Trojans was devastating. Pride and relief had blinded them to reason. Now, fear and disbelief gripped their hearts. The very symbol they had admired, the wooden horse, had become the instrument of their destruction. Every step they had taken to welcome it inside the walls now contributed to their downfall. The city, once secure behind its walls and towers, was thrown into chaos, with warriors struggling to organize defenses against an enemy they had believed long gone. Odysseus, leading the Greeks from within the city, moved with both decisiveness and strategy. He ensured that key leaders and points of resistance were targeted first, preventing organized counterattacks. The Greek warriors, familiar with the city from years of siege, exploited their knowledge of Trojan streets, gates, and alleys to outmaneuver defenders. The fall of Troy was unfolding not as a chaotic battle, but as a carefully executed campaign in miniature, a masterclass in strategy and surprise. Civilians, caught unprepared and confused, fled in panic. Fires were ignited in multiple parts of the city, both as diversion and consequence of combat. The Greeks' plan, which relied on shock and sudden action, ensured that organized resistance was nearly impossible. Even the bravest of the Trojans found themselves disoriented, trying to defend a city that had been breached not through brute force alone, but through the cunning manipulation of their own trust, pride, and curiosity. As the night progressed, the Greeks methodically secured Troy, moving from one strategic location to the next. Their discipline and training, honed over years of war and preparation inside the horse, allowed them to act with precision and efficiency. By the time dawn approached, much of the city had fallen into Greek hands. Troy, which had resisted for 10 years, now faced devastation within a single night. The brilliance of the Trojan horse lay not only in its concealment of warriors, but in the psychological mastery that had allowed an entire city to be lulled into complacency, manipulated by desire, pride, and belief. The fall of Troy began with a single act of human ingenuity, amplified by patience, discipline, and a deep understanding of psychology. The Greeks had turned the Trojans' own expectations against them, a gift of wood, an act of feigned surrender, and the careful orchestration of perception had dismantled an empire from within. The success of the plan was a testament to the combined power of strategy, deception, and the courage of those willing to execute a seemingly impossible mission under extraordinary conditions. By the early hours of dawn, Troy's fate was largely sealed. The city that had survived countless assaults, legendary heroes, and years of siege had been undone not by walls, weapons, or gods, but by the audacity of human intelligence, cunning, and patience. The Trojan Horse had fulfilled its purpose. It had transformed hope into vulnerability, curiosity into chaos, and complacency into defeat. As dawn crept over Troy, the city that had stood unyielding for 10 years of siege now found itself in utter disarray. The Greek warriors, concealed moments before within the wooden horse, had emerged like shadows into the streets, moving with precision, purpose, and deadly efficiency. The operation inside Troy was no longer simply a surprise attack. It had evolved into a full-scale strategic assault, guided by years of planning and knowledge of the city's layout, weak points, and human psychology. Every movement, every strike, was designed to maximize chaos and minimize resistance. Odysseus, ever the master strategist, orchestrated the Greek forces with surgical precision. He and his warriors acted as a spearhead, targeting critical locations first: the city gates, the armories, and the central citadel. These were not arbitrary choices. Securing the gates prevented reinforcements from outside, ensuring that the Trojans trapped within the city could not escape or regroup. Controlling the armories allowed the Greeks to seize weapons and limit the ability of the defenders to organize a coherent defense. And taking the citadel, the symbolic and strategic heart of Troy, was essential to breaking morale and asserting control over the city's leadership. Every Greek warrior knew their role. Those who had hidden in the horse now used their intimate knowledge of the city's streets to move silently, striking key positions before the Trojans could respond effectively. Communication was subtle, reliant on gestures, prearranged signals, and disciplined coordination. The Greek army's experience from years of siege allowed them to anticipate the Trojans' likely responses, adapting in real time to exploit confusion and fear. This level of strategic execution was unprecedented, turning the element of surprise into a devastating advantage. The chaos among the Trojans was immediate and overwhelming. Many soldiers were caught completely off guard, unable to comprehend how Greek forces could appear suddenly within their city walls. Panic spread rapidly, further eroding organized resistance. Some attempted to mount a defense at key points, but the speed and precision of the Greeks prevented these efforts from gaining traction. Others fled, seeking refuge in homes or temples, only to encounter additional Greek contingents. The combination of psychological shock and tactical superiority created a cascade of disorientation, turning what might have been fierce resistance into fragmented, desperate skirmishes. Odysseus' strategy extended beyond physical combat. He understood that fear and perception could be as powerful as weapons. Fires were deliberately set in strategic locations to create confusion and panic, obscuring movement and providing cover for Greek forces. The roar of flames, the cries of terrified citizens, and the clash of swords amplified the psychological impact of the assault. The Greeks used every available tactic to ensure that the Trojans could not form an effective response, demonstrating that the conquest of Troy relied not merely on force, but on manipulation of both space and human emotion. Key Trojan leaders were targeted swiftly. Their capture or elimination prevented them from organizing a coordinated counterattack and shattered the morale of remaining defenders. Odysseus's men moved like an invisible hand through the city, striking decisively at leadership and strategic points, while leaving the impression of chaos everywhere else. By neutralizing the command structure early, the Greeks ensured that even those Trojans who had not yet encountered a warrior directly would still face the consequences of a leaderless defense. The fall of Troy was not only tactical, but psychological. The city's defenders were paralyzed by uncertainty and fear. Meanwhile, Greek contingents outside the walls converged with those who had emerged from the horse. This coordinated effort ensured that the city's perimeter was fully under Greek control, preventing reinforcements or escape. Odysseus's foresight in combining internal and external forces was crucial. The Greeks did not simply infiltrate, they encircled and dominated. The precision of this approach ensured that even the largest concentrations of Trojan resistance were quickly subdued, consolidating the city before organized defense could form. Civilians, caught between panic and confusion, added to the chaos. Streets, alleys, and marketplaces were clogged with people fleeing from the onslaught. Some hid in homes or temples, hoping to survive the night. Others attempted to aid their warriors, only to be caught in the expanding conflict. The Greeks exploited this human element skillfully, using the population's fear and movement to their advantage. Every action was a testament to the brilliance of a strategy that combined military, psychological, and environmental manipulation into a single, cohesive plan. The city's once mighty walls, which had withstood countless assaults, now served as silent witnesses to the effectiveness of cunning over strength. Gates, previously secure, were controlled by the Greeks. Streets, previously patrolled by vigilant Trojans, were filled with confusion and terror. The combination of surprise, planning, and tactical expertise demonstrated that even the most fortified city could fall if human perception and psychology were skillfully exploited. The Trojan horse had not merely delivered men into the city, it had delivered the ultimate strategic advantage, allowing the Greeks to dictate the battle's terms from within. Odysseus himself remained a central figure throughout the operation. His presence inside the city allowed him to coordinate strikes, assess resistance, and adapt the strategy as events unfolded. Every decision was calculated, every movement purposeful. He demonstrated not only leadership, but also the integration of intellect and courage in combat. The Greeks' success within Troy was not merely a matter of force, it was a demonstration of the power of planning, observation, and decisive action. By the time dawn approached, the majority of Troy's strategic points had been secured. The Greek forces had achieved dominance over the city, not through brute force alone, but through a combination of preparation, timing, psychological insight, and decisive action. The streets, once filled with prideful citizens and confident soldiers, now echoed with panic, confusion, and the sounds of a city under calculated siege. Inside Troy, The operation exemplified the ultimate synthesis of cunning and execution. The Trojan horse, which had seemed a gift, had fulfilled its function. It delivered elite warriors directly into the heart of the city, allowing them to exploit human trust, pride, and curiosity. The Greek strategy had transformed deception into domination, turning a symbolic act into a decisive military maneuver. Every element, the horse, the retreat, the selection of warriors, and the psychological manipulation of the Trojans, culminated in this moment of unrelenting precision and control. The fall of Troy had begun in earnest. The city, which had resisted for a decade, was now unraveling within a single night. The streets, once proud and fortified, were now a labyrinth of fear, confusion, and strategic conquest. Inside the city, the Greeks executed their plan flawlessly, demonstrating that intellect, patience, and daring could achieve what years of siege could not. Troy, legendary and formidable, was in the grip of a strategy that would resonate through history, a lesson in the power of cunning over brute force. In the unfolding chaos of Troy's final night, the city's leaders played a critical, yet ultimately tragic role. For 10 long years, they had been responsible for guiding the defense of one of the most formidable cities of the ancient world. Priests, elders, generals, and nobles had kept the morale and strategy of Troy intact through prolonged siege, repeated assaults, and countless skirmishes. Yet, on the night of the horse's deception, even the most vigilant and capable leaders found themselves compromised, not by force alone, but by the combined impact of cunning, psychology, and the Greeks' precise strategy. One of the most notable figures among the Trojan leadership was priest Laocoon, whose warnings about the wooden horse have echoed through histories. He famously cautioned that a gift from the Greeks could not be trusted, declaring that Greeks bearing gifts were rarely sincere. Laocoon's suspicions reflected strategic reasoning. After a decade of war, the Greeks' sudden withdrawal seemed improbable. He recognized that the horse, while impressive, could conceal danger. His voice, though rational and prescient, was ultimately drowned out by hope, desire, and the collective longing of the Trojan citizens to believe in their own triumph. Laocoon's fate, as tradition recounts, underscores the peril faced by leaders who opposed the prevailing sentiment. Despite his wisdom, the Trojans largely ignored his counsel. Some sources suggest that Laocoon was struck down by divine forces, reinforcing the interpretation among the people that the horse was indeed sacred. Whether by accident or divine intervention, his death served to further silence cautionary voices. It illustrates how leadership in moments of deception can be undermined not just by enemy strategy, but by psychological manipulation that exploits belief, fear, and superstition. The Trojan generals and military leaders also faced profound challenges. Conditioned by years of warfare, they were accustomed to direct combat, siege defense, and tactical planning. Yet the Greeks had shifted the battle into the realm of deception, a psychological domain where conventional strategies were less effective. As the horse stood in the city's square, these leaders debated whether to dismantle it, examine it, or bring it inside. Their decisions were influenced by the priests, elders, and the collective hope of the citizens. Even the most experienced generals found themselves trapped by uncertainty. Opposing the crowd could cause unrest, while accepting the horse seemed like a gesture of prudence and divine favor. Their hesitation proved critical by allowing collective optimism, curiosity, and misjudgment to guide decisions. The Trojan leaders inadvertently facilitated the Greek plan. They underestimated the combination of audacity and precision embodied by Odysseus's design. Leaders who might have recognized the threat too late were paralyzed by competing priorities, protecting the city, honoring religious interpretations, and satisfying citizens' desire for celebration. In this conflict between reason and perception, human judgment was clouded and opportunity was lost. The role of leadership extended beyond mere decision making. Trojans who had been responsible for guarding the city's gates, organizing the army, and ensuring the readiness of troops found their authority undermined by the suddenness and ingenuity of the Greek assault. Elite soldiers emerging from the horse neutralized key positions rapidly, disrupting any attempt at coordinated defense. The Greek warriors, trained in both stealth and urban combat, exploited gaps in the city's command structure, moving quickly to paralyze leadership and sow confusion. The failure was not merely tactical, it was a profound demonstration of how strategic deception could neutralize experienced commanders without direct confrontation. Even the city's civilian leaders, those responsible for civic administration, were caught unprepared. Temples, markets, and residential areas became chaotic zones as fear and confusion spread. Leaders attempting to organize citizens for shelter or defense faced immediate threats from emerging Greek forces, highlighting the limitations of authority when visibility and control are compromised. The Greeks' plan was as much a psychological assault as a physical one, turning human expectation, leadership hierarchies, and urban management into tools of disruption. Interestingly, the failure of Trojan leadership also illustrates a broader principle of strategy. The effectiveness of deception often depends on exploiting predictable human tendencies. The Trojans' leaders were skilled in combat and strategy under conventional conditions, yet their inability to anticipate the Greeks' audacious ruse made them vulnerable. Odysseus's design capitalized on both human hope and hierarchical reliance. By understanding how leaders would likely react to a gift of awe and apparent surrender, the Greeks manipulated not just the citizens, but the very command structure that had preserved Troy for a decade. The psychological interplay between leaders and citizens was critical. Leaders who might have resisted the horse were influenced by priests and seers, whose interpretations were amplified by the collective excitement and relief of the population. The Trojans' desire to believe in victory and divine approval became a tool of manipulation, weakening the decision-making capacity of even experienced generals. In essence, the Greek plan exploited both the human mind and the institutional structures of Troy, turning the city's own leadership against itself without direct combat at first. Finally, the actions or inactions of the Trojan leaders contributed to a cascade of consequences that defined the fall of the city. Their failure to dismantle or examine the horse, their hesitation to enforce rigorous vigilance, and their reliance on cultural and religious interpretations allowed Odysseus's plan to unfold seamlessly. By the time the Greeks emerged from the horse and moved strategically through the city, Trojan leadership had been effectively neutralized, unable to coordinate a meaningful resistance or protect critical locations. The city's defenses, both physical and organizational, crumbled under the weight of careful preparation and audacious deception. In hindsight, the role of Troy's leaders highlights the delicate balance between human psychology, authority, and decision making in high stakes situations. Even the most experienced and courageous commanders can be undone when faced with a combination of cunning strategy, psychological manipulation, and exploitation of human desires. Their actions, or failures, served to accelerate the fall of Troy, proving that victory in war is determined not solely by strength in numbers, but by foresight, perception, and the ability to navigate uncertainty. The Trojan leaders, despite their valor and experience, became a testament to the power of human misjudgment. When confronted by a meticulously executed plan of strategy and deception, their critical decisions, influenced by hope, pride, and the perceived authority of divine signs, facilitated the Greeks' triumph. In the final hours of Troy, leadership faltered under manipulation, highlighting that even the mightiest city can fall when its leaders are outmaneuvered in mind as well as in battle. Once the Greek warriors emerged from the wooden horse, the city of Troy became a theater for one of the most remarkable examples of coordinated urban warfare in history. The Greeks, long thought to have retreated, now spread through the city's streets with precision, striking at strategic points and exploiting every weakness in the Trojans' defenses. The genius of their operation lay not merely in surprise, but in the meticulous coordination that allowed a relatively small number of men inside the horse to act as the spearhead of an entire army. Every movement was calculated, every action deliberate, and every Greek warrior knew their role with unwavering clarity. Odysseus, the mastermind of this complex maneuver, orchestrated the operation with the skill of a seasoned commander. He understood that victory required more than brute strength. It demanded efficiency, timing, and the ability to exploit both human psychology and the urban landscape. From his vantage, he observed the unfolding chaos, signaling small groups to move to critical locations, while others neutralized key targets. The Greek forces inside and outside the city operated like a single, synchronized organism, each unit reinforcing the other, creating an unstoppable wave of tactical precision. The first priority was securing the gates. With the city's walls breached and the main entrances compromised, reinforcements from outside Troy could not intervene. Soldiers who had remained hidden outside the city joined with those from the horse to overwhelm the minimal guards, using a combination of speed, skill, and intimidation. These gates were crucial. Controlling them not only prevented escape, but allowed Greek forces to funnel movement within the city, channeling the panicked Trojans into areas where they could be more easily contained or neutralized. Every action reflected strategic foresight, ensuring that no Trojan force could regroup and mount effective resistance. Inside the city, Greek warriors split into specialized teams. Some moved to seize key military locations, including armories and barracks, to deprive the Trojans of organized defense. Others targeted the central citadel, the symbolic and strategic core of Troy, whose capture would both break morale and secure a command center for Greek operations. Each unit operated under strict discipline, aware that the rapidity of their actions would determine the overall success of the mission. This coordination transformed what might have been a chaotic urban battle into a methodical and devastating campaign. Communication among Greek forces was subtle but highly effective. Signals were transmitted through gestures, torches, and prearranged sounds, allowing teams to coordinate without alerting the Trojans to their presence. Warriors emerging from the horse moved with intimate knowledge of the city's layout, avoiding bottlenecks and anticipating resistance. Meanwhile, external Greek forces blocked escape routes and created diversions, ensuring that any Trojan who attempted to flee would encounter further obstacles. The strategy combined intelligence, psychological insight, and practical combat skills, creating an environment in which confusion magnified the effectiveness of each Greek action. Psychological warfare was as critical as physical combat. Panic spread rapidly through the city, amplified by the Greeks' calculated movements and the chaos of fires and alarms. The Trojans, exhausted from years of siege and lulled into complacency by their apparent victory, were ill prepared for coordinated attacks emerging from their own streets. Greek warriors exploited this, striking quickly at leaders and strategic points while allowing the natural disorientation of the population to magnify the impact. Every encounter, every skirmish, reinforced the perception that the city was overrun, further weakening the morale of those who remained. Odysseus's strategy also included the deliberate isolation of key Trojan figures, city leaders, generals, and prominent citizens were targeted to prevent them from organizing resistance. By neutralizing authority figures early, the Greeks ensured that even those who retained courage or skill could not coordinate effectively. This approach demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the interplay between leadership, morale, and strategic advantage. The fall of Troy was thus as much a psychological conquest as a military one, with every Greek movement designed to exploit human behavior as effectively as city geography. Fires, set strategically throughout the city, served multiple purposes. They created diversionary chaos, obscured movement, and magnified the sense of overwhelming threat. In the midst of smoke and flames, Greek forces could maneuver through streets and alleys with relative freedom, using the city's disorientation against itself. Trojans attempting to regroup or fight back often became trapped by smoke, debris, or the rapid appearance of Greek units, further compounding confusion. The combination of controlled chaos and tactical precision was a hallmark of Odysseus's planning, demonstrating that deception and coordination could overcome even formidable fortifications. Greek forces also used environmental knowledge to their advantage. Years of siege had given them intimate familiarity with Troy's streets, gates, and defensive positions. They knew where ambushes could be set, which streets would be congested with fleeing citizens, and which towers offered the best vantage points. This knowledge allowed small teams to have an outsized impact, neutralizing resistance swiftly and ensuring that the city's remaining defenders were forced into reactive, uncoordinated responses. The Greeks' mastery of both space and timing allowed them to dictate the terms of engagement throughout Troy. Coordination extended beyond combat logistics. Some Greek units created diversions to pull defenders away from critical areas, while others secured communication points to prevent the Trojans from coordinating counterattacks. The combined use of misdirection, rapid strikes, and psychological manipulation transformed the city into a controlled battlefield, where the Greeks' calculated actions ensured that every move by the Trojans served to hasten their own defeat. The Trojan horse, once a silent symbol of triumph, had now become the epicenter of a coordinated operation that turned the city against itself. By the early morning, the Greek forces had consolidated control over key strategic points. Streets were dominated by coordinated units, the gates were secured, and the remaining defenders were disoriented and demoralized. The combination of internal and external coordination had rendered the city vulnerable, making further resistance almost impossible. Troy, which had endured 10 years of siege, was now at the mercy of a meticulously planned operation executed by highly disciplined and strategically brilliant forces. The fall of Troy demonstrated the unparalleled effectiveness of coordinated strategy in urban warfare. The Greeks' ability to integrate stealth, timing, environmental knowledge, and psychological insight transformed the city into a controlled battlefield, allowing a relatively small number of warriors emerging from a single wooden horse to dictate the course of events across an entire metropolis. Every aspect of their coordination reflected not only military skill, but a deep understanding of human behavior, timing, and the exploitation of perception. The Greek forces' orchestration throughout Troy highlights a critical principle of strategy: the ability to combine intelligence, precision, and psychological insight can achieve what force alone cannot. By coordinating every movement, targeting every key location, and exploiting every opportunity for disorientation, the Greeks ensured that Troy's fall was both swift and inevitable. The city that had withstood years of direct assault had been undone by ingenuity, preparation, and flawless coordination. As the Greeks moved with calculated precision through Troy, the ordinary citizens became the unintended participants in a nightmare of chaos. Streets that had once bustled with trade and laughter were now filled with panic. Families fled from the advancing Greek forces, seeking refuge in homes, temples, or even the city walls, often only to find escape routes blocked or cut off. The cries of terror echoed between the walls, creating confusion that the Greeks had predicted and manipulated with masterful precision. The human response to sudden invasion is predictable, yet compelling. Fear overrides reason, and in Troy, that fear was magnified by the realization that the threat had emerged from within. The very symbol they had revered, the wooden horse, was the origin of the disaster, a terrifying revelation that intensified panic. Citizens attempted to aid their soldiers or protect loved ones, but the combination of disorientation, smoke from fires, and coordinated Greek attacks made organized efforts nearly impossible. The Greeks exploited this instinctual chaos. Panicked movements created bottlenecks, separating defenders from one another and isolating groups for swift neutralization. Citizens, inadvertently, became obstacles for their own soldiers, slowing any potential counterattack. The result was a citywide spiral of disorder, amplified by human reaction to fear, noise, and unexpected violence. Troy's fall was being hastened not just by armed assault, but by the predictable, uncontrollable dynamics of human behavior under duress. Fires set throughout Troy played a critical strategic role in amplifying confusion and preventing coordinated resistance. The Greeks deliberately ignited structures near key defensive points and major streets, creating barriers and obscuring sightlines. Smoke filled the narrow alleys, while the flames produced disorienting light that made it difficult to distinguish friend from foe. Citizens and soldiers alike were forced to make split-second decisions in an environment designed to mislead and trap them. Diversions were equally effective. Small Greek units created noises, staged ambushes, and feigned attacks in areas away from their main objectives. These actions drew defenders from crucial positions, making it easier for primary assault teams to take control of gates, citadels, and strategic strongholds. By combining fire, sound, and misdirection, the Greeks manipulated both the physical and psychological landscape of Troy. Every element was calculated to create maximum disruption with minimal expenditure of resources. This blend of environmental manipulation and precise timing exemplified Odysseus's understanding of urban warfare. It wasn't brute force alone that secured Troy's fall. It was the careful orchestration of sensory, spatial, and psychological factors to create chaos and opportunity. The city, renowned for its strength, was undone by strategy executed with brilliance and patience. Greek forces systematically neutralized Troy's leadership and elite defenders to ensure the city's collapse. Priests, generals, and prominent warriors were among the first targets. Removing leadership not only disorganized the army, but also shattered morale among the citizens, leaving them directionless and vulnerable. Even those soldiers who retained courage found themselves isolated, unable to coordinate effectively or protect critical points. Specialized Greek units were tasked with precision strikes against defensive towers, gate guards, and command posts. These assaults were fast, calculated, and overwhelmingly effective. By removing the city's structural and psychological anchors, the Greeks ensured that every remaining defender was forced into reactive, scattered, and ultimately futile resistance. Troy's defeat was as much a testament to cunning and timing as it was to the skill of individual soldiers. The combined impact of leadership removal, citizen chaos, and environmental control illustrates how the Greeks converted a single act of deception into full-scale urban conquest. The fall of Troy, once inevitable, was now accelerating as the carefully coordinated strategy unfolded flawlessly. Timing was everything in the Greeks' plan, and it defined the success of their assault on Troy. From the initial emergence of the warriors, from the wooden horse to the coordinated attacks across the city, every action was synchronized with precision. Odysseus had calculated the moment when exhaustion, celebration, and complacency among the Trojans would make them most vulnerable. The combination of human psychology and operational timing ensured that resistance was minimized and confusion maximized. The Greeks emerged from the horse at night, taking advantage of darkness to conceal their movements. This stealth allowed them to reach strategic locations before the Trojans could mount an organized defense. External forces approached simultaneously, creating pressure from multiple directions. The timing of attacks was designed to overwhelm the city's defenses before any countermeasures could be effectively coordinated. Even the seemingly chaotic spread of fires, diversions, and ambushes was part of a temporal strategy. Fires were lit when certain streets were occupied by defenders, maximizing panic and hindering communication. Diversionary attacks occurred in calculated sequences to draw attention away from primary objectives. The Greeks' mastery of timing transformed what could have been a chaotic urban battle into a precise, controlled operation that exploited both human behavior and city layout. The Greeks' greatest weapon was not only their swords, but their manipulation of Trojan psychology. The entire Trojan Horse scheme relied on exploiting human emotions, pride, hope, and desire for divine favor. When the horse appeared outside the city, it elicited awe, leading many Trojans to disregard caution. Their leaders' decisions were influenced by priests and seers, whose interpretations reinforced the belief that Troy had achieved a miraculous victory. Once inside, the psychological manipulation intensified. The sudden emergence of Greek warriors from the horse created disbelief and terror. Fires, diversions, and targeted strikes amplified panic, causing Trojans to make irrational choices and inadvertently hinder their own defense. The Greeks understood that fear spreads faster than reason. Chaos is self-reinforcing. Every movement of soldiers, every controlled noise or appearance of threat amplified the sense that the city was overrun. Even as Greek forces seized control of gates and leadership positions, their continued use of deception ensured that the Trojans were reacting to perceptions rather than reality. This manipulation of human behavior was as essential as the physical assault, demonstrating that understanding psychology can be as decisive as any weapon in warfare. By the early hours of the morning, the Greeks had seized nearly every strategic location in Troy. The gates, once impenetrable, were firmly under Greek control, allowing reinforcements from outside to enter the city without resistance. Armories, barracks, and defensive towers were captured, ensuring that Trojans could no longer access weapons or organize effective counterattacks. Key civic and religious buildings were also secured. Temples, which had served as both spiritual and social centers, were neutralized to prevent their use as rallying points. Even the central citadel, the symbolic heart of Troy, was under Greek control, cementing both practical and psychological dominance. Each seizure was executed with precise coordination, timing, and minimal waste of resources, reflecting Odysseus's careful planning and understanding of urban warfare dynamics. The coordinated takeover demonstrated a sophisticated blend of strategy, intelligence, and human insight. Troy's physical strength, fortifications, and prior experience in defense were rendered irrelevant against a force that combined deception, timing, and discipline. By the time daylight approached, the city was effectively in Greek hands, its fate sealed by audacity, cunning, and flawless execution. Even as the Greeks consolidated control over Troy, pockets of resistance remained. Some of the city's warriors and civilians refused to surrender, attempting desperate counterattacks or barricading themselves in familiar strongholds. These final acts of defiance, though courageous, were largely ineffective against the strategic dominance of the Greeks. The combination of internal chaos, captured leadership, and coordinated assaults had left the Trojans disorganized and vulnerable. The remaining defenders often found themselves isolated, Streets and alleys were controlled by Greek units, and movement was monitored with precision. Attempts to regroup were met with swift retaliation. Even where Trojans could muster a small defensive effort, they faced the psychological weight of realizing the city was no longer under their control. Fear, exhaustion, and confusion made organized resistance nearly impossible, demonstrating the effectiveness of the Greeks' multifaceted approach. These final struggles highlighted not only the bravery of Troy's citizens, but also the devastating impact of strategy over mere force. Even the strongest warriors, when denied communication, leadership, and organization, were powerless. By systematically neutralizing resistance, the Greeks ensured that Troy's collapse was complete, illustrating the combined power of tactical skill, timing, and psychological manipulation in urban conquest. With Troy's defenses neutralized and resistance dwindling, the Greeks turned their attention to consolidating control over the city. Armories, treasuries, and civic stores were secured, ensuring that resources would be under Greek authority. Leaders were either captured or neutralized, preventing any resurgence of organized opposition. This phase of the operation was not chaotic looting, but disciplined consolidation. Reflecting Odysseus's meticulous planning, Greek units moved through the city systematically, securing strategic locations and eliminating threats. The combination of prior preparation, intelligence on the city's layout, and precise timing allowed them to maintain order while establishing dominance. Fires set earlier were allowed to continue in select areas, both as psychological reinforcement and to prevent remaining Trojans from regrouping. Even in the aftermath of chaos, the Greeks demonstrated discipline, ensuring that the city's resources and strategic points were firmly under their control. The takeover of Troy illustrates the full spectrum of strategy, from deception to direct action to consolidation. By combining psychological manipulation, coordinated attacks, and disciplined resource management, the Greeks transformed what could have been a chaotic urban battle into a controlled, decisive operation that secured both victory and long-term advantage. By sunrise, Troy had been decisively overrun. The once proud city, which had withstood years of siege and legendary assaults, now lay in chaos, smoke rising from strategic fires, streets littered with debris, and the echoes of panic still audible. The Greek plan, executed with precision, had turned a single act of cunning, the Trojan Horse, into a comprehensive conquest. The aftermath was as psychological as it was physical. Citizens faced not only loss of property and life, but the shattering of trust in their leaders, in divine favor, and in their own judgment. Temples, homes, and fortifications had been compromised, and the very symbol of their triumph, the wooden horse, had facilitated their downfall. For the Greeks, however, the operation was a resounding success. They had achieved victory with minimal casualties and maximum strategic efficiency, demonstrating the unmatched power of careful planning, timing, and psychological insight. The fall of Troy became a legendary example of how human ingenuity, combined with strategy and audacity, can overcome even the most fortified city. It serves as a reminder that in warfare, perception, patience, and cunning are as decisive as force, and that a single act of deception can have consequences that echo through history for millennia. The Trojan horse has endured as one of the most famous examples of military deception in history. Its significance extends far beyond the specific fall of Troy. It represents the strategic principle that ingenuity, surprise, and psychological insight can be as powerful as armies or fortifications. Generals and strategists throughout history have studied this event not merely as a story, but as a case study in the application of cunning over brute force. The horse itself was not just a physical object, it was a symbol, a tool for manipulating perception. By presenting the Greeks' withdrawal as an act of surrender or offering, Odysseus exploited Trojan desires and assumptions. This blend of engineering and psychology illustrates that effective strategy often relies on understanding human behavior as much as geography or weapons. Every detail, the size, craftsmanship, and placement of the horse was designed to maximize the likelihood that it would be brought inside the city. The lesson from the Trojan horse is timeless. Even the strongest fortifications can be breached if defenders underestimate the importance of intelligence, vigilance, and critical thinking. By studying this episode, military leaders recognize that deception, timing, and the exploitation of expectation are as critical to victory as physical strength or numerical advantage. It is a testament to the enduring power of strategic creativity. Beyond military tactics, the Trojan horse offers profound lessons in psychology and human behavior. Troy's downfall was enabled by desire, pride, and overconfidence. Citizens and leaders alike fell victim to wishful thinking, assuming that a magnificent gift must be benevolent. The Greeks anticipated this cognitive bias, using it to orchestrate one of the most successful deceptions in history. The event highlights the importance of skepticism and critical thinking in high stakes situations. Even experienced leaders and seasoned warriors were manipulated because their decisions were influenced by emotion and social pressure. The fall of Troy demonstrates that human perception is often the weakest link in defense. Fear, curiosity, and hope can all be leveraged by an intelligent opponent. This psychological insight has transcended military contexts. In business, diplomacy, and crisis management. The principle remains. Understanding how people interpret information and anticipate events can provide decisive advantages. The Trojan horse teaches that strategy is not only about force, but also about shaping beliefs and guiding decision making, a lesson that is as relevant today as it was in ancient times. The story of the Trojan horse has endured not only in military history, but also in global culture. It appears in literature, art, theater, and even modern media as a symbol of cunning, surprise, and unexpected consequences. From ancient epics like Virgil's Aeneid to contemporary references in films, books, and video games, the horse has become synonymous with the idea that appearances can be deceiving. Its legacy also serves as a cautionary tale. Societies and individuals are reminded to question what seems beneficial, to evaluate risks critically, and to remain vigilant even in moments of apparent victory. The horse embodies the duality of human ingenuity. It can create triumph or cause downfall, depending on how perception and action align. The Trojan horse's cultural significance is enduring because it encapsulates universal truths about human nature, pride, curiosity, and desire can be exploited, and intelligence and creativity can overcome strength and numbers. Its story continues to fascinate audiences worldwide, inspiring reflection, analysis, and imagination centuries after the fall of Troy. The construction of the Trojan horse was as much an engineering feat as it was a strategic maneuver. The Greeks had to design a structure that could conceal dozens of warriors while appearing as an impressive, believable gift. The choice of wood, its dimensions, and the balance of structural integrity with portability were critical. Too small, and it would not house enough men. Too large, and it would draw suspicion. Odysseus's plan accounted for every physical consideration, ensuring the horse would be both awe-inspiring and functional. The interior was compartmentalized to maximize space while keeping warriors hidden and silent. Ventilation was subtly integrated to provide breathable air during the long hours of concealment. The exterior, polished and decorated, projected a sense of reverence and craftsmanship, reinforcing the perception of a divine offering. Every nail, joint, and plank was chosen and placed with purpose. The horse's engineering was inseparable from its strategy, proving that technical mastery and strategic insight must often go hand in hand. The design of the Trojan horse demonstrates the importance of adaptability and creativity in problem solving. By combining art, engineering, and psychology, the Greeks created a tool capable of altering the course of history. Its construction was not simply about hiding men, it was about crafting a believable story in wood and form, a story the Trojans would unwittingly complete by bringing it into their city. After a decade-long siege, the Greeks faced a city that seemed unassailable by direct assault. Troy's walls were legendary, its defenders seasoned and determined, and previous attacks had failed to yield decisive results. Faced with such formidable obstacles, the Greeks turned to deception as a strategy that could achieve what brute force could not. The Trojan horse offered a solution that minimized casualties, maximized surprise, and exploited human behavior. The Greeks recognized that 10 years of conventional siege had exhausted both sides. Morale, fatigue, and human expectation could be manipulated to gain advantage. The horse allowed them to bypass Troy's formidable defenses by infiltrating the city from within, turning the defenders' trust and assumptions into vulnerabilities. Instead of risking open combat, they created a situation in which the Trojans unknowingly facilitated their own downfall. This decision highlights the sophistication of Greek strategic thinking. Warfare is not solely about strength, it is about efficiency, timing, and understanding your opponent. By choosing deception over continued assault, the Greeks demonstrated patience, intelligence, and adaptability. The Trojan horse became a masterstroke of strategic innovation, combining psychological insight with operational brilliance. The Greeks' use of the Trojan horse brought immense rewards, both tangible and symbolic. Militarily, the city was theirs. 10 years of siege culminated not in prolonged bloodshed, but in swift and decisive conquest. The Greeks captured resources, weapons, and treasures within the city, while their strategic control ensured minimal losses. Their disciplined approach allowed them to consolidate power quickly, securing victory in a single, coordinated operation. Beyond material gain, the psychological and cultural impact was profound. The fall of Troy cemented Greek reputation for cunning, strategy, and ingenuity. It proved that intelligence, patience, and creativity could achieve outcomes that brute force alone could not. The Trojan horse became a symbol of cleverness and strategic mastery, inspiring generations to study, emulate, and celebrate the combination of art, deception, and tactical brilliance. For the Greeks, the Trojan horse was not just a military victory, it was the culmination of years of planning, endurance, and calculated risk. Its success demonstrated the effectiveness of deception, discipline, and precision, creating a legacy that would resonate for millennia and ensuring that their story, strategy, and ingenuity would be immortalized in history. Now, with a smile on your face, you will have a good understanding of the Trojan horse and a good night's sleep. Goodbye, dear friend. See you next time.